We want to welcome all of you from around the world to today's online conference of the International Schiller Institute. There can be no peace without the bankruptcy reorganization of the dying transatlantic financial system. This two-day conference will devote itself to formulating as well as proposing a comprehensive solution to today's conjunctural crisis. A recent editorial in the German publication Handelsblatt described the present crisis in these terms. All over the world, and not just in Russia, economies are now under stress. Apart from the arms corporations and oil companies, there are no winners. Putin alone could never have triggered this global energy, food, and economic crisis. The invitation to today's conference features LaRouche's triple curve collapse function. This illustration was invented by LaRouche to describe in graphic terms the divergence between investments in the real physical economy, which have been collapsed, and the hyperinflation of both financial and monetary instruments. This is the very process we see today, a process that has been underway for decades and which LaRouche forecasted would lead to not merely a monetary, but a physical breakdown of economy. There's no longer anything that can stop that collapse, including even a so-called financial nuclear war between the Anglosphere, sometimes also called NATO, and China, Russia, India, and many nations in Africa and South America. What is happening today was not inevitable and was not unknowable. It was foreseen. The events of the past months did not catalyze this process. Those that still oppose that realization must now, against their will, as well as perhaps their knowledge, continuously propose courses of action that will actually result in the direct opposite of what they intend. They are self-doomed by what they call the rule of law. They are ruled by the law of their own wrong but addictive axioms. The absurd triumphalist sanctions policy, now destroying Europe and the United States, and which may even be strengthening those against which it was aimed, is an example. Classical composer Robert Schumann's setting of Heinrich Heine's poem, The Two Grenadiers, is a most accurate current history news report about our present war mania. It is performed by Schiller Institute board member, the late Bill Warfield.
Nach Frankreich zogen zwei Grenadier, die waren in Russland gefangen. Und als sie kamen ans deutsche Quartier, sie ließen die Köpfe hangen. Da hörten sie beide die traurige Mehr, dass Frankreich verloren gegangen. Besiegt und geschlagen das tapfere Heer und der Kaiser gefangen. Da weinten zusammen die Grenadier, wohl ob der kräftigen Kunde. Der eine sprach, wie weh wird mir, wie brennt meine alte Wunde. Der andere sprach, das Lied ist aus, auch ich möchte mit dir sterben. Doch hab ich Weib und Kind zu Haus, die ohne mich verderben. Verschert mich Weib, verschert mich Kind, ich trage weit besser Verlangen. Lass sie betteln gehen, wenn sie hungrig sind. Mein Kaiser gefangen. Gewähr mir, Bruder, eine Bitt. Wenn ich jetzt sterben werde, so nimm meine Leiche nach Frankreich mit, begrab mich in Frankreichs Erde. Das Ehrenkreuz am roten Band sollst du aufs Herz mir legen, die Flinte gib mir in die Hand. Hand und geht mich den Degen. So will ich liegen und horchen still, wie eine Schildwachtengabe, bis einst ich höre Kanonengebrüll und wehende Rosse getrabe. Dann reitet mein Kaiser wohl über mein Grab, viel Schwerter klirren und blitzen, viel Schwerter klirren und blitzen. Dann steig ich gewaffnet hervor aus dem Grab, den Kaiser zu schützen.
We need not be so tragic as the deluded grenadiers were in our time. But in order to avoid that fate, the transatlantic nations must reject the axioms of empire. How can those axioms be changed? Zepp-LaRouche, who forecasted this moment, both named that empire and identified how it could be defeated.
So the way the British Empire functions is like the Persian host. Inside the Persian host, you had an inner core of fighters who were called the immortals. These were the sons and daughters of leading Persian families, generally oligarchical families, whose sons and daughters would take up a military profession as the Achaemenid fighters, corps. But the Persian Empire had a limited number of the so-called immortals with their basket-work shields. Most of the Persian Empire was composed of a host of auxiliaries, of like Napoleon's horde marching into Russia in 1812. An army of not French, but mercenaries, auxiliaries. The power of the British at the core, they're very powerful at the core. Very tough at the core. Of course, you got a lot of laws and goofs and so forth around there, but you got a few inner core who really knows what's going on. They're dangerous. But like the Persian Empire, the British Empire is a Babylonian host, ruled by the whore of Babylon, reincarnated in the form of the mad cow who sits on the throne over there. So therefore, when you get into a period where all of these auxiliaries, admirers in the financial community, and you got to see these goofballs that run the trust funds in New York City these days. They're absolute goofballs. Read the Wall Street Journal. There isn't a brain in the joint. They're all babbling idiots. But the British depend upon their auxiliaries. There are auxiliaries in every country. The prostitutes who are owned by the British, who suck up to the British, who would think the greatest thing in the world to stand within 6 meters of the Queen. Now, these are the auxiliaries. These are the Persian host. Come a financial crack. All of these idiots start jumping out of windows and doing other wild things. They are routed, self-routed, by the breakdown in their dream, their delusion. So at that point, the inner core, while it's still tough and dangerous, its auxiliaries aren't functioning so well. That is the time you defeat them.
Such a victory cannot be successfully accomplished, however, unless an international group of thinkers resurrects an earlier form of international association that was founded prior to the American Revolution and was actually responsible for it. France, Germany, Poland, Spain, Italy, and importantly, Catherine the Great's Russia were all very involved in making the American Revolution possible. Ironically, recently, Russian President Vladimir Putin's references to Peter the Great, whose great northern expedition was comparable to the search in America for the Northwest Passage, may point to a natural area for strategic engagement of Russia, the United States, and China of an utterly different nature than the disastrous geopolitics pursued by today's United States State Department. Back in 2007, Zepp-LaRouche wrote, As the government of Russia's President Putin search for cooperation with the USA illustrates the point, the dying out of the generations of relevant patriots from among the veterans of the 1939 to 45 war, or World War II, has left the United States with governing strata which are far more poorly equipped culturally and intellectually to cope with the most crucial challenges of our planet now than were the relevant veterans of the last great war. Then he said, Russia and the United States alone could not decide the outcome of the present global crisis, but without their appropriate cooperation, no solution for the world at large exists. The Bering Strait Transport Tunnel Project is an excellent illustration of the practical point. This map, prepared by the Schiller Institute's Hal Cooper many years ago, shows the World Land Bridge from the vantage point of the Bering Strait project, which was first proposed by Danish explorer Vitus Bering and inspired by Peter the Great, whose 350th anniversary is celebrated this year. The World Land Bridge proposal was devised by LaRouche and associates in dialogue and consultation with China, Russia, India, and many other nations of the world over a period of 30 years. This is the path forward, the economic development basis for a new world security architecture, not NATO and not geopolitics. To discuss this new paradigm for humanity and how we will achieve it, it is my honor to introduce the founder and head of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Her speech is titled, Let's Win Mission Impossible or Find Another Planet. Good morning, Helga.
Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Schiller Institute all over the world, imagine you are sitting in a high-speed train which is going at 1,000 miles an hour. And you know that the railroad will in a few minutes reach a cliff, which means that the train will crash into an abyss, and in which the train, and including all the passengers, will die in a hell of fire. And you know that the engine driver is totally mad and will do absolutely nothing to prevent a certain train wreck. That is approximately the situation the people of the United States, of Europe, and unfortunately the entire world as a result, find themselves in, only that it is much worse, because the train wreck is actually a nuclear war. And the hell of fire is actually 5 times hotter than the center of our sun, which is 100 million degree Kelvin, because that is the temperature caused by a nuclear explosion. And if you can't find the emergency brake and pull it in time, after there will be a nuclear winter. And there will be nobody to even investigate how it came to this final moment in the history of the once promising human species. The train I'm describing here is the policy of NATO, of the US, the EU, and the countries who side with them, and their central banks. The fateful train got on the wrong track, ending with the crash over the cliff, with the hubris that guided the intention to establish an unipolar world based on the Anglo-American special relationship, when the Soviet Union disintegrated and the West arrogantly declared itself the winner of the Cold War. It is important to recognize that the intention to, quote, ruin Russia has been there since the end of the Soviet Union. And this is not Russian propaganda. It is a very well documented historical fact. The Western-induced shock therapy against the economy of the Yeltsin period had the explicit intention to reduce a nuclear superpower into a third world raw material exporting country, which reduced the Russian industrial capacity from 1991 to 94 to only 30%. it resulted in a demographic collapse of 1 million less Russians per year. George Soros did everything possible to organize a brain drain to eliminate Russia as a potential competitor. Please show the slides. 5 NATO expansions to the east, including the establishment of the Aegis Ashore missile defense system in Poland and Romania, the Mk-41 launchers, which can be used to launch Tomahawk missiles and other strike systems, were part of a continuous policy of encirclement, against which Russia repeatedly issued red lines indicating where they would see their existential security interests threatened, and against which Russia developed the new nuclear systems like the hypersonic missile Avangard, a highly maneuverable intercontinental missile with Mach 20 speed, the hypersonic cruise missile Kinshal, fast underwater drones, the hypersonic cruise missile Zircon, etc., etc. Other wagons were added to the train along the road, such as the color revolution, the interference into the internal affairs of former Warsaw Pact countries, financed to the billions by the NED, the IRI, or the US State Department, or even a Western-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014, which brought in Nazi groups which had been the asset of Western intelligence services since World War II, to which the Russian-speaking populations of Crimea and Donbass did not wish to submit. When Putin reacted to the increasing military activities by the Ukrainian army, which now is clear had been trained by the US and British military for many years, as well as maneuvers flying US bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons up to the Russian border by demanding legally binding security guarantees from the United States and NATO on December 17th, he not only got no answers to the core demands, namely guarantees that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO and no offensive weapons would be installed at the Russian border, but unnamed White House officials stated explicitly in an anonymous, quote, background briefing on January 25th, that is before the military invasion in Ukraine, that the aim of the sanctions regime was to, quote, devastate the Russian economy and prevent any attempt of modernization and diversification away from raw material production. On March 4th, the Financial Times gloated that the, quote, weaponizing of the financial architecture by the West would drive Russia into a government debt default. And there is the quote from French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire with a statement that was so vitriolic that he had to withdraw it. We will provoke the collapse of the Russian economy. We are waging total economic and financial war against Russia, Putin and his government. And let's be clear, the Russian people will also pay the consequences. The Royal United Institute, RUSI, the self-proclaimed oldest military think tank of the British monarchy, described the policy against Russia as boiling the Russian frog. You all know this image that the frog does not jump out of the water if you slowly increase the temperature. And calls to provoke, the RUSI calls to provoke a Cuban missile crisis on steroids over a Ukrainian attempt to retake Crimea militarily and to come up with creative and nuanced proposals how to steal Russian frozen assets. On cue, the Ukrainian general Dmytro Marchenko declared that once the necessary weapons were received, the destruction of the Kerch Bridge connecting the Russian mainland with the Crimea would be target number one, and the weapons would be used to retake Crimea. The delivery by the US of long-range weapons into Ukraine and their possible use to strike into Russian territory, such as the high-mobility artillery rocket systems, makes the United States under international law immediately a participant in the war, which could trigger instantly a hot war between Russia and the United States, which no side would want to lose, and therefore an escalation to a full nuclear exchange could happen very quickly. Coming back to the image of the mad engine driver in our train, the horrifying reality seems to be that the establishment of the West is playing this thermonuclear chicken game without apparently having the intelligence to think through that the consequences of this reckless adventurism could be the annihilation of all of us, including themselves. While it is clear to the leaders of a great number of countries in the world, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, that the present strategic crisis did not start on February 24th with, quote, Putin's unprovoked war of aggression, the synchronized war propaganda coming from almost all politicians, the media, and think tanks in the United States and Europe reflect a deep-seated, hateful mindset against Russia and increasingly also against China, which has nothing to do with the reality of these countries, as everybody knows who does know them, but which is the result of the perpetuation of the Cold War mentality, ready to risk the hot war at any moment, which apparently has been cultivated over the last 3 decades as a groupthink in the institutions of the mainstream. The desire to, quote, ruin Russia, as the unspeakable NATO-affine German foreign minister expresses, is a return to barbarism in international relations and reflects a deep-rooted problem in her understanding of diplomacy, which she should represent as the first diplomat of the country. The offer for Ukraine to join the EU, even as a candidate, which was made by Scholz, Macron, Draghi, and Johannes at their recent trip to Kiev, is again a further step in the escalation. In reality, it is the equivalent of offering Ukraine NATO membership, because since 2007, there is the duty of military assistance in the EU treaty, and Ukraine could demand military assistance from all EU member states, of which all but 4 are also members of NATO. That means that if only one country gets militarily involved in warfighting, this country can automatically evoke the duty of assistance of NATO. And this comes on top of all the delivery of heavy weapon systems and training of Ukraine troops, which, according to the US constitutional expert Bruce Fein, has made, as well as the deployment of foreign mercenaries inside Ukraine, has made the US, Great Britain, and other countries involved already co-belligerents. To stay with the image of the train, the front wheels of the locomotive could be hanging over the cliff already. Obviously, Russia and other countries could not avoid noticing that the US and her allies have gone far beyond the simple containment towards the Soviet Union of the Cold War, but that the West openly now speaks about, quote, ruining Russia, to cut relations, quote, forever, as if we were not living on the same Eurasian continent. In this geometry, there is no room for a diplomatically negotiated end of the war in Ukraine, but only a victory of Ukraine and a defeat of Russia. In this scenario, the desired decimation of Russia then creates room for a containment strategy against China, which the US and Great Britain regard as the most challenging competitor. The campaign to also disentangle from China economically, accompanied by similar demonization, is already in full swing. The net result of all of this is not only that we are teetering at the verge of a global nuclear war, but that we are in a gigantic process of self-destruction of our economy, our social stability, and the very foundations of our society. This policy will ruin the US and British economy as well, but the effect on Germany will be absolutely catastrophic. The tendency towards a hyperinflationary blowout of the everything bubble was already in process as the result of the reckless money printing of the central banks and repeated bailouts for the banks and speculators since 2008, which was already a systemic collapse of the system long before the war in Ukraine started. But the effect of the everything sanctions and suicidal capitulations by Germany, like in the case of Nord Stream 2, and planned embargoes against Russian oil and gas, will drive the prices for gas, energy, food, and all the other essential goods for life up in the next weeks and months, and for large segments of the population to an unaffordable height. What is threatening is a total social collapse, a mass bankruptcy of small and medium enterprises. Already supply lines in many areas are interrupted, for which China's COVID policy has only a very small part of responsibility. But the Russia sanctions affect almost all areas. Wood for construction from Russia is no longer there. Oil tankers, insurance are not being paid. Fertilizers are lacking, etc., etc. The effect on the developing countries is by orders of magnitude more devastating. According to the UN and the World Food Programme, 1.7 billion people are threatened with famine in the coming period. The entire economies of many countries are completely disintegrating, such as Lebanon or Peru and many others. Since the runaway inflation is already threatening entire segments of industry and agriculture, in the formerly rich Germany, every sixth person is already skipping 1 meal per day because of the increase of food prices. Starting with the Federal Reserve by 0.75% now and again in July, the central banks have begun to raise the interest rates. This brings up the immediate danger of a serious debt crisis in the emerging countries and a chain reaction collapse of firms in the formerly advanced sector. We are in the midst of a blowout of the entire transatlantic financial system. And if this is not remedied soon, we could face a total plunge into chaos before the end of the year, which is even acknowledged by the president of the World Bank, David Malpass. The sanctions are naturally hurting Russia, but much less than the West, as Putin just triumphantly declared at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. They are actually almost a blessing in disguise, since they have accelerated the creation of an entirely new financial and economic system, in which many principles defined by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, are being applied. Anchored on China's Belt and Road Initiative, several organizations are in the process of de-dollarization, a currency which is not regarded as secure after the seizure of assets by the US Treasury of several countries, and multilateral trade is now occurring in ruble, rupees, renminbi, and other national currencies. For Russia, it resulted in a pro-Asian change in the geographical structure of its foreign economic relations, which almost fully compensates the cutting of trade with the EU. A conference of the Eurasian Economic Forum took place in Bishkek, which discussed, among other things, the introduction of a digital ruble for cross-border payment, bypassing a banking system subject to sanction pressure, and serious investments in R&D to build up independent capacities in all fields. The BRICS nation will have their summit in a few days, on June 24th in China, where they will discuss the inclusion of new members. According to the Duma President Volodin, the emerging G8 of Russia, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Iran, and Turkey already has bypassed the G7 in terms of the GDP. Other organizations and nations are working towards a new model of a global order, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, ASEAN, and many nations in the global south. What all of these countries are aiming at is the wish for common poverty alleviation, real development of their physical economy, national sovereignty, the right to choose their own model of social and economic development, and cooperation in their mutual interest. And they have found that essentially with the cooperation with China and Russia, which is the reason why many of them did not bow to pressure to join the condemnation of Russia for what is happening in Ukraine. So the democracies, quote, are really only the US, Great Britain, the EU, which however is divided, Japan, Australia, and South Korea. So when at the end of this month, the annual NATO summit meets in Madrid to present a plan for a global NATO and a new security doctrine without a real economic development plan, naturally, which it certainly will not have, it will fail to address the actual needs of a world faced with famine, pandemic, economic chaos. It will have a big posture, but it will be a colossus on clay feet. In 1971, my late husband, Zepp-LaRouche, made what is very likely the most important and prescient analysis ever made in history. When President Nixon abandoned the Bretton Woods system by taking the dollar off the gold standard and replaced the fixed exchange rates with floating ones, he made the forecast half a century ago that a continuation of that policy would inevitably lead to a new depression, a new fascism, and a new world war, unless a completely different system would be established. And this is exactly the point where we are right now. He also prescribed since long the remedy in 4 points, basic points. Unless the transatlantic system should go the way of the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany in 1923 or face a sudden blowout, there needs to be first a global Glass-Steagall banking separation, exactly what Roosevelt did in 1933. That means that the commercial banks must be put through bankruptcy reorganization. Once they have been cleared of different categories of junk, such as involvement in derivatives, they have to be put under creditor protection. The other banks and financial institutions have to bring their books in order, but under no circumstances can receive any more bailout packages under what guise, however. And if they can't live without taxpayer money, they should close up shop. Secondly, every country needs to set up its own national bank in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton, as it was done successfully with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation with Roosevelt and the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, Credit Institution for Reconstruction, which was modeled on the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And this was the main engine for the German economic miracle in the post-war period. This way, the power of credit generation for investment in projects of the common good is given back to the sovereign governments instead of being the bazooka of the private bankers. Thirdly, long-term multilateral cooperation agreements have to be set up between these national banks for investments in international infrastructure projects, such as corridors, industrial parks, agriculture, water management systems, energy production and distribution, a modern health system in every country, education systems, and so forth. These agreements of credits with long duration and low interest rates do already represent a new credit system. With that system, there must be periodically fixed exchange values of the national currencies, limited convertibility, exchange and capital controls, and an outlawing of the creation of markets for currency speculation. And fourthly, there needs to be an international crash program to arrive at the commercial use of fusion technology because that will give humanity energy and raw material security and therefore eliminate a major cause for war in the past. Together with space cooperation and major investments into basic R&D of life sciences, this will create for the world economy the next economic platform with a higher productivity, which will compensate for the losses in productivity due to the monetarist and falsely understood ecological policies of the neoliberal model. Now, why did I give this presentation the title Mission Impossible? Because literally everything, the continued existence of the entire humankind, depends on the prospect that we can convince the United States and European nations to stop the insane, costly, and self-destructive policy of confrontation with Russia and China, go for an immediate ceasefire and diplomatic solution in Ukraine, and start a process of reconstruction of the world economy. The way out of both the war danger and the financial collapse is a new security and development architecture which takes the interest of every country on the planet into account, that of Russia, China, the United States, European nations, and emphatically that of the developing countries. Given the present policies of the, quote, democracies, this seems impossible, but it is not. In the coming weeks and months, the utter failure of the neoliberal model will become so absolutely clear to everyone that neither, quote, freezing for freedom, as the German economic minister Habeck suggests, who wants to degree how cold it has to be in the apartments, nor, quote, starving for democracy, will have much appeal. What we need now is a movement of state citizens, of ordinary people from all walks of life, who become leaders when they see that their country has been hijacked by a policy establishment that doesn't care about them, that only thinks about how to protect their positions and privileges, and whose policies have created a class of billionaires and millionaires and a majority of people whose life savings are eaten up by hyperinflation. In each nation, we need a movement of citizens who have the courage to act to correct what they know to be wrong, from the submission to the presently unbearable opinion dictatorship, which allows only the official NATO narrative to be repeated, and which accuses anybody who tries to shed some light on why we are in this crisis to be a Putin agent or in the service of the Communist Party of China. Why not invite commentators from Russia, China, India, Mexico, Afghanistan, Ghana, Syria, or Pakistan into our talk shows, instead of the ever-same clique of synchronized pundits who try to make us believe that the earth is flat and that the snow is black? Yes, for the sake of the wonderful democracy and human rights, let us discuss the case of Julian Assange and what crime he committed. Let us reject what is rotten in our culture, the perversion and banality of the entertainment industry, which is designed to make us stupid and passive. To win Mission Impossible, we have to revive the best cultural tradition in every country, in Europe and in the United States. The Asians are already doing it. The Germans have to become again a people of poets and philosophers. The Italians, great artists of the Renaissance. The French, scientists of the École Polytechnique. The Americans should turn their country again into a temple of liberty and beacon of hope. Only if we are willing to change ourselves in this way and become better human beings who don't go around like beast men, or beast women for that matter, who want to, quote, ruin other countries, but who want them to develop in the best possible way, who want them to blossom and have all the talents of their people unfold, we will have a beautiful future for ourselves. And then we have the courage to get up and pull the brake of that terrible train we are sitting in, and stop the dash into Armageddon. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to our International Schiller Institute online conference. There can be no peace without the bankruptcy reorganization of the dying transatlantic financial system. This is panel one of our two-day conference, and you have just heard the founder and head of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Our next speaker is Professor Andrey Kortunov of Russia. He is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, and his topic is Russia and the indivisible security of all nations.
First of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude for having a chance to be a participant to this very important and very timely event. I hope that we will have a candid and an intellectually gratifying discussion on the current international trends and what they might mean for people like us and for our respective countries and societies. I would like to focus in my brief presentation on the trend which I would label as the current consolidation of the West. I think that one of the most explicit manifestation of this trend can be seen in the consolidated reaction of major Western powers to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We've seen a very fast, very well coordinated response to the Russian military operation, unprecedented level of anti-Russian sanctions, and also unprecedented level of military, economic, political, and intelligence support for Ukraine. We've seen a lot of pressure, coordinated pressure on Russia in many international organizations, multilateral institutions, and also coordinated pressure on many countries of the global south in order to convince them to take the right position in this crisis. However, I think it is fair to say that the Western reaction to the Russian military operation in Ukraine is not the only manifestation of the current trend towards a more consolidated West. If we look at the events of last year, we will see many other indicators which clearly deserve our attention. For instance, a new military political alliance, the so-called AUKUS, emerged in the Pacific. The United States tried and were quite successful in institutionalizing the quadrilateral dialogue on security issues, the so-called Quad, with India, Japan, and Australia participating. The Biden administration has conducted a large-scale summit for democracies in the end of last year. We can indicate very consistent attempts to activate NATO, to increase the military spendings of European countries, allies of the United States. We've seen Finland and Sweden making an important decision to join NATO. We've seen new activism within the group of G7. So there are many manifestations that suggest that the West is entering a phase of relative consolidation. If we look back into history, I think that the previous cycle, the cycle of decentralization and disintegration of the West, arguably started back in 2003, when the United States had very serious problems in trying to convince some of its closest partners to support the US military operation in Iraq. And though the split between the United States and the United Kingdom on the one hand and continental European powers on the other was not a strategic division, but definitely it signaled that the centrifugal trends started to dominate in the Western alliance. These trends were accelerated by the Obama administration when the White House announced the so-called pivot to Asia. Now, this pivot was met with a lot of suspicion in Europe because it was interpreted as an attempt of the United States to move away from Europe and to replace Europe as the top strategic priority by U.S. Strategic alliances in the Asian Pacific region. Of course, the Trump administration, 4 years of the Trump administration also contributed to this disintegration, and so did the British Brexit from the European Union. So for at least a decade, maybe more than a decade, the West was moving towards more disunity. And today we see a reverse trend. And the question, of course, is how long this trend will last for and how it will manifest itself in coming years. I think that it is fair to say that the Western countries will enhance their cooperation in the military technical area, and NATO is likely to go global. I think that we will see some indicators of this trend already at the next NATO summit, which will take place in Madrid just in a couple of days from now. I think that we will see an attempt to globalize the area of responsibility of the NATO alliance, though some NATO members might still be reluctant to extend their responsibilities beyond the European continent. I think that we will also see more coordination of a political strategy of major Western powers, and although it would not be easy to convince some of European nations to take a stronger position on China, the United States will definitely try to move Europe in this direction. I think that we might also observe some success stories in attempts to overcome the current economic disagreements and contradictions between the two sides of the Atlantics. For instance, the Biden administration has already decided to lift some of the tariffs on European steel and aluminum. I think that some kind of arrangement between Boeing and Airbus might be reached before too long. I think that there are chances that some other symbolic trade agreements might be reached between the United States and Europe. I also believe that the two sides will do their best to coordinate their policies in high tech, and we are likely to see transcontinental consortia of major high-tech industries in areas like IT and biotechnologies and new sources of energy, and that would create technological chains of new generation. I think it's also important that the West will try to dominate the global commons agenda. Western countries, mostly the European Union, but also the United States, will try to define the rules of engagement in areas like the energy transition and information management and climate change, transborder migration management, biodiversity, and other areas like that. It is definitely an important factor of the Western consolidation, and though I foresee complications on this road, still I think that in the immediate future some kind of coordination in these areas is possible. And definitely this coordination reflects the weakening of Western positions and concerns about geopolitical rivals and adversaries of the West, mainly China, but also other emerging economies and emerging political powers. So the question is how long this consolidation might last for, and at what particular juncture the trend might be reversed. I think that we can expect this trend to continue for a couple of years, but in the end of the day, new deconstruction of the consolidated West is almost unavoidable. There are many reasons for that. First of all, I think that it would be very difficult to maintain the current level of unity given divergent economic interests between the United States and Europe. For instance, I do not see how the United States might get the European Union opening its agricultural markets for US products. I don't see how the United States will easily accept German cars and spare parts to German cars imported to the United States. So economic disagreements will be there to stay. The United States will try to continue exploiting its privileged position in the global economy and its privileged position in the world financial system. It would be increasingly difficult to maintain dollar as the main reserve currency of the world. And I think that the importance of dollar will gradually, slowly, but steadily go down. And that would create additional problems between the United States and its allies. I think there are also disagreements on long-term economic and political interests towards other parts of the world. For instance, for Europe, it would be more problematic to break with China. And I think that the European Union will be reluctant to start an economic war, a trade war with China, even if the United States pushes this issue really hard. It is probably impossible to synchronize political development cycles of the Western world. Most of European countries moving in the direction of left political coalitions or left centrist political coalitions, while in the United States, the common midterm is likely to favor neocons in the Republican Party. The two models, the Anglo-Saxon model of social and economic development is not really convergent with the continental European model. And this is likely to remain one of the problems and one of the limitations on the way of a more consolidated West. I think that we should also keep in mind that China will continue to be a divisive factor in relations between the United States and Europe. And not only China, but many of other countries that belong to Global South are likely to be a bone of contention between America and Europe, because the United States and the European Union have very different approaches to the Global South and to the transfer of resources from the Global North to Global South. Finally, we should not forget that in relative terms, the collective West is getting weaker, and there are many unresolved problems that have to be addressed by Western countries. Many of these countries have divided societies. We see a lot of polarization within Europe, in countries like France, for example, and this polarization was reflected in the results of the recent elections, both presidential elections and elections to the National Assembly. I will see polarization in the United States with the reformist wing of the Democratic Party moving further left and the Republican Party moving further right. We see major infrastructural problems in the United States and in Europe which remain unattended. So these problems are likely to reduce the influence of the West in the world. and to promote disintegration trends within the global West. In the end of the day, I think geography will matter less than it matters right now. And the odds are that the notions of the East and the West, the notions of the North and the South are likely to gradually lose their relative importance and will be replaced by new concepts of situational ad hoc coalitions that might unite diverse countries from all corners of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kortunov. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's International Schiller Institute online conference. There can be no peace without the bankruptcy reorganization of the dying transatlantic financial system. This is panel one of our two-day conference, and you've just heard Professor Andrey Kortunov of Russia, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Our next speaker is Dr. Wang of China, the Executive Director of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies in Renmin University. His topic is why China's rise is beneficial to the world.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my latest thoughts on China relations with the world. Over the past 40 years, China has created a historical record for the rise of a great power. For 40 years, there has been no war or participation in war. And at the same time, there has been no economic crisis or financial crisis, and it has risen successfully. Rise without crisis and rise without war. This is a new record, which the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Japan have not achieved. This is a new phenomenon of political economy and international politics, and its mysterious need to be rediscovered. However, in the eyes of Western media and think tank, China is a threat, and the most malicious speculation is often used to predict China's future. In fact, this is a reflection of the evil in the West. They themselves have done many bad things before, and they think others will do bad things too. In fact, the rise of China represents a new civilization. China presumes win-win cooperation, while the West presumes zero-sum. When confronted with a difference, China is willing to negotiate and resolve them, while the West uses cartoons and sticks, and war is often the preference of the choice. From this perspective, the rise of China is an innovation and upgrade in the history of great power, which means that the development of a great power no longer repeats the wars, hegemony, colonization, refugees, conflicts, and killings in the history of the West, but peace, cooperation, win-win, stability, and development. This is a contribution of China's rise to human civilization. In terms of international development, China's rise has contributed about 30% to world economic growth for more than 10 consecutive years. The world economy would be worse off without China's growth. China has undertaken more than 60% of African infrastructure construction. Made in China promotes the realization of commodity democracy and shopping freedom in all countries in the world. With the same money, you can buy more and cheaper Chinese goods. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, China has exported about half of the ventilators and masks to the world. Now, China is surpassing the United States to become the world's largest consumer market. In the future, it will continue to import $2 trillion of goods every year, which is a power driving force for the sustainable development of the world. For developing countries, China offers a new option for development. In the past, all developing countries could only follow the Washington Consensus. But nearly 80 years after World War II, poor countries are still poor, and few countries have upgraded from low-income country to middle-income country. However, China, as the largest population country, has achieved leapfrog growth through more than 30 years of efforts without replicating the Washington Consensus. Its GDP has increased by 80 times, and it has changed from a low-income country to a middle-income or higher-income country. It is expected that by 2030, it would become a high-income country. To achieve leapfrog growth, many countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia are rethinking the Chinese model, and some countries are constantly learning from Chinese experience. From the Western world, China's rise is also beneficial. Cheap and good made in China save the average American family $1,000 a year, just like Steve Jobs' Apple innovation. China's technological innovation put pressure on the West to break monopoly and promote fast social development. China has joined most of the international treaty and international organization established after World War II. And it is the biggest force to defending the international order, rather than withdrawing as easily as President Trump did. Western discourse creates fear of China, believing that China would replace Western hegemony. But it is actually a fear of a country that will no longer obey their orders, so that it can no longer do whatever it wants. This worry is arrogant and selfish. The West cannot dominate the world forever. Every country has independent rights. The West fears that mainland China will forcefully unify Taiwan. I would like to say that Taiwan is a part of China, and more than 180 countries in the world have established diplomatic relations with mainland China, all of which recognize this. Mainland China has been working hard to resolve the issues of reunification peacefully with utmost patience. Now, I think it is the United States that is provoking, exporting arms to Taiwan and balancing offshore. If there's no U.S. intervention, I'm confident that China can achieve peaceful reunification. Some Western media also spread rumors. Why does China military spending increase so fast every year? Because you must believe that the U.S. military expenditure is 3 times that of China. From NATO's bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia in 1999, to the U.S. military plane hitting Chinese fighter jet in the South China Sea in 2001. The U.S. aircraft carrier often travels through the Taiwan Strait, and the technological blockade of recent years. The reality is that the U.S. is threatening China. Isn't China still allowed to improve its defense capacity? A basic factor is that all the frictions between China and the United States in the past were provoked by the United States first, and China was only a late mover. Let us think about it calmly. Military friction, trade wars, technological suppression, Huawei or Wanzhou or Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan which one is not the United States provoking first? So all in all, I think a rising China is beneficial to the world. The stronger China is, the less the US will dare to provoke China, and the more stable China-US relations will be. And the stronger China is, the more peaceful and development the world will be. So my conclusion is that trust China. This is what I want to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. And if you have just joined us, we want to welcome you to our International Schiller Institute online conference. There can be no peace without the bankruptcy reorganization of the dying transatlantic financial system. This is panel 1 of our 2-day conference, and you've just heard Dr. Wan Wen of China, the executive director of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies in Renmin University. Our next speaker is Colonel Richard Black, retired U.S. former head of the U.S. Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon and a former Virginia state senator. His topic is the United States is leading the world to nuclear war.
Well, thanks for letting me join you today. I want to start by making clear that I'm not a left-wing pacifist. I served in uniform for 32 years, love my country, risked my life for it hundreds of times. I flew 269 combat missions as a Marine helicopter pilot, and my aircraft was hit by ground fire on 4 flights. I volunteered for ground combat with the 1st Marine Division and made 70 bloody combat patrols. I was wounded. My radio men were both killed fighting beside me as we tried to rescue a surrounded Marine outpost. So I first served as a Marine Corps pilot and then later as an Army lawyer. I retired as chief of the Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, testifying before Congress, preparing executive orders for the President, and advising the Senate Armed Services Committee on issues of national concern. Later, I was a conservative voice in the Virginia House and Senate for a period spanning 2 decades. Let me start right off by saying that I believe that Ukraine has lost the war. Now, of course, the war is not over, but it is lost. Let me show you why. This has become an artillery duel. Russia fires 50,000 shells a day, 10 times more than Ukraine. The Washington Post says that Ukraine is almost completely out of ammunition, and there are no replacements for its Soviet-era ordnance. On June 10th, the Post reported that Ukraine is suffering 1,000 casualties a day, including 200 killed. The rate of casualties has doubled in just 3 weeks. Let's put that in perspective. Vietnam was America's last truly bloody war. We lost 60,000 men in 10 years. That's about 6,000 killed every year. With a much smaller population, Ukraine is losing 6,000 soldiers killed every month. This is a casualty rate 12 times higher than we suffered in Vietnam. But you have to then look at the populations of both countries. Before the war broke out, Ukraine had 43 million people. But with refugees, it's down to just 38 million today. The U.S. population during Vietnam numbered about 200 million. So our population was roughly 5 times larger than Ukraine's. This, on a per capita basis, this means that their casualty rate is roughly 60 times greater than the U.S. suffered during the very bloody war in Vietnam. Ukrainians have fought with courage, but no nation can sustain such casualty rates for long. Ukraine is finished. On June the 12th, yesterday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg all but admitted that Ukraine would soon be forced to sue for peace. He said, "The only question is what price are you willing to pay for peace? How much territory, how much independence, how much sovereignty are you willing to sacrifice for peace?" Stoltenberg's remarks suggests that NATO recognizes that the war is lost. It's now become an unpleasant distraction that simply needs to be wrapped up as far as NATO is concerned. The sanctions war has failed. The entire financial might of the Western world was unleashed against Russia. The Biden administration swore that the Russian ruble would be crushed into dust. They boasted of destroying the Russian economy and inspiring a revolution. They would create such hardships that Russia would revolt and overthrow their president. But today, the ruble is stronger than before the war. This year, it has been the strongest of all currencies. Russian inflation peaked around 15% and is expected to subside. But as their inflation tops out, Europe's and America's has just begun skyrocketing dangerously. Even this morning, the price of Bitcoin dropped 5,000 points in just overnight. The stock market is becoming extremely erratic and rocky. Biden's attempt to strangle Russian trade has failed. Far from blocking their trade with other nations, The Economist reports that Russia is generating a record trade surplus with $1 billion a day flowing in from oil and gas. Russia's $250 billion trade surplus more than doubled its surplus in the year before the war. Despite sanctions, Russia has forged stronger ties with China, India, South Africa, Iran, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, all of which continue trading at enhanced levels with Russia. Important countries in the global south are refusing to obey Washington's order to impose sanctions. Independent countries fear the U.S., but they resent being told who they may and may not trade with. Dictating sanction policy to sovereign nations is diminishing the world's respect for America. From the outset of the war, Russians have never experienced shortages of food, housing, heating, fuel, or gasoline. Anyone who expects Russians to crack from the loss of Gucci purchase, or Big Mac hamburgers do not understand the Russian psyche. Hopes of ousting President Putin have died. On March 1st, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson predicted that sanctions would bring down the Putin regime. Since then, Boris Johnson has nearly been ousted himself in a parliamentary vote of no confidence. At the same time, President Putin's popularity rose to 83%, which is greater than any of his Western counterparts. Meanwhile, the propaganda war is unraveling. At the outset of war, the United States unleashed a carefully orchestrated barrage of anti-Russian propaganda. All dissenting voices were blocked from the media. Western media breathlessly reported the dramatic exploits of someone called the Ghost of Kiev, a pilot so skillful that he shot down an incredible 40 Russian jets before heroically dying in battle. But the Ghost of Kiev was a complete hoax. He was a media concoction, a fiction, a fraud who never existed at all. There was another important false report about Ukrainian border guards trapped by the Russian Navy on Snake Island. Ukraine reported that they refused to surrender, cursed their tormentors, and fought to the death. Zelensky even announced that they would each receive the nation's highest honor, the Hero of Ukraine. But this too was a fraud and a hoax. Those guards facing Russian warships actually did the sensible thing and surrendered without a fight. They were taken unharmed aboard a Russian vessel and returned to Ukraine as part of a prisoner swap. Ukraine's use of concocted stories like these puts into question not only those reports, but others claiming war crimes or battlefield victories. Yet until recently, the US and NATO unquestioningly cited inaccurate Ukrainian assessments of the war. Recently, however, news outlets have begun acknowledging the possibility of a Ukrainian defeat. On June 10th, Newsweek reported that even the deputy head of Ukrainian military intelligence has admitted that Ukraine was at risk of losing the war to Russia. The first cracks are forming, and soon the world must come to grips with reality. The war is lost. Americans are also losing interest in the war. On June the 13th, the British outlet, The Express, reported a poll showing that Americans think that the shortage of baby formula is 5 times more important than the war in Ukraine. Only 5% of the population see Ukraine as a top priority, compared with 36% who worry about inflation, the economy, and jobs. 5% now believe that sanctions have hurt the US more than Russia. Americans are fickle, and they have moved on. Europe's the big loser in the war. US sanctions blocked Europe from using reliable, low-cost Russian gas and oil. We forced them to import costly liquefied natural gas from America. US sanctions have battered Europe, which relies heavily on imported Russian commodities and fuel. America's infatuation with alternative energy has, over years, compelled Europeans to rely on undependable solar and wind power. Restricting access to Russian oil and gas makes the coming winter a time of great peril for Europe. One key U.S. military objective has always been to block Germany from opening its vital Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline. That pipeline was built by several countries over a span of 11 years. It was intended to double the gas flow to Germany and the rest of Europe and to guarantee their energy security. But after spending a fortune on the pipeline, the U.S. has rendered the massive project useless in order to shift the market to American liquid natural gas. Actions like these show that Europe no longer enjoys full sovereignty. It is now subordinate to the whims of London and Washington. Before the war, Europe operated with moderate defense budgets. Russia was no threat, and China was an important trading partner. Secure with its neighbors, Germany chose to maintain just 200 operational tanks. But war hysteria has forced Germany and other NATO countries into an unnecessary arms race that will impose enormous increases on European defense costs for many years. Ironically, the march to war has effectively subordinated the European Union to NATO, thus restoring Great Britain to its position of dominance over continental Europe despite Brexit. Now, nuclear war still looms. There are voices speaking of nuclear war today. Heather Conley, head of the influential German Marshall Fund, does not rule out a further escalation, saying that the West must not be intimidated by Russia. Conley said, "We must prepare for the use of tactical nuclear weapons." A European official separately suggested arming Ukraine itself with nuclear weapons, which is an extraordinarily reckless action likely to trigger an unconventional Russian response. It's time for Ukraine to negotiate for peace and end the useless slaughter. Perhaps it could propose a framework reminiscent of the highly successful Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which saw the Soviet Union and Allied powers withdraw their forces from Austria in exchange for Austria amending its constitution to make it forever a neutral, non-aligned nation and forbidding foreign troops from ever setting foot in Austria again. Ukraine could adopt similar provisions. NATO should consider a separate treaty designed to make Ukraine a permanent nuclear buffer zone between East and West. By agreeing that Ukraine would never be admitted to NATO, it could permanently reduce regional tensions and significantly reduce the risk that either side might accidentally trigger a deadly nuclear incident. By acting before its defensive lines collapse, Ukraine could demand control over coastal areas surrounding the port of Odessa. It could insist on controlling all of Kiev on both sides of the Dnieper River, and it might insist that Russia withdraw any troops west of that river. Obviously, control of many other areas must also be negotiated, but this might be a starting framework for peace. That concludes my remarks today. I'm very grateful to Schiller Institute for the effective efforts they've taken at promoting peace and for preempting the insane drive towards nuclear war. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Black, a man of true courage. And if you have just joined us, we want to welcome you to our International Schiller Institute online conference, There Can Be No Peace Without the Bankruptcy Reorganization of the Dying Transatlantic Financial System. This is panel one of our two-day conference. You've just heard Colonel Richard Black, former head of the United States Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon and a former Virginia state senator. His topic was the U.S. is leading the world to nuclear war. Our next speaker is Sam Pitroda of both the United States and India. He is an innovator, an entrepreneur, and policymaker. He has been a former cabinet minister and advisor, serving over the years 7 different Indian heads of state. His talk is titled India and the Emerging New World Architecture. Good morning, Sam.
Thank you, Dennis. Ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Chicago. I want to begin by thanking Schiller Institute, Helga, Dennis, David, and others for giving me this opportunity. It is indeed a special privilege and honor to be with these distinguished speakers. I come to you more as a global citizen, concerned about not just the present Ukraine crisis and potential impact on our peace, prosperity, food, energy, and economy, but also someone who is very concerned about the future of humanity. On one hand, we have great potential in technologies of the future, especially IT, life sciences, energy, to transform our world. Unfortunately, our focus is still on power and profits, and not on planet and people. I'm here to represent my own personal views as an Indian who has lived in the US for 58 years and who admires democracy, freedom, justice, equality, diversity, human development, technology, and believes in truth, trust, and love. When I look at the global geopolitical conversation that is going on in the world today, I worry about the fact that we are deciding on our future by looking at our past. It is unfortunate that we still worry about unipolar, bipolar world. We still want to dominate other countries, take advantage of poorer people, and really not focus on the potential that technology offers today. One, to equalize world, network people, collaborate, cooperate, co-create. As opposed to our architecture today is still fundamentally designed for command and control. And that really worries me a lot. I wrote a book recently called Redesign the World. And the main focus in that book is all about the potential of technology, especially hyperconnectivity. Hyperconnectivity is all about networking. It's all about scaling by connecting smaller enterprises. It is about non-hierarchy. It is about openness, accessibility, connectivity, democratization, decentralization. Unfortunately, we are not using a lot of these ideas to build new world. New tools are being used to promote old world concept and not create new world in which there is prosperity for all, there is dignity for mankind, and there is clear focus on planet and people. Every activity today is all about power and profits. Markets go up and down because of some global conflict somewhere, and we have been witnessing that in the last few months because of crisis in Ukraine. On one hand, we can justify what's going on. On the other hand, we realize that irrespective of justification, innocent people are being killed on both sides. Properties are being destroyed for no reason. And there is no solution in sight because it is almost like a Mexican standoff. Now we are beginning to see the impact of a lot of this on energy, food, and economy. The economic model that we created 70, 80 years ago, based on strong dollar, IMF, World Bank, doesn't seem to work anymore in a hyperconnected world. We need a new economic order. And this is a big ask. We need an economic order which is more decentralized, which is more based on smaller enterprises to scale, which is based on local talent, local consideration, attention to local soil, local food, but at the same time, respect and promote globalization. We tend to see world in black and white, in boxes. We need to learn to see world in grays. It is never about either globalization or localization. It is both at the same time. The key is to understand what to globalize and what not to globalize. You look at the fertilizer and how it affects local soil, microbes, and really destroys local food. In the name of technology, globalization, we are really creating a situation where local livelihood is affected. At the end of the day, employment, economy affect everybody. Average person doesn't understand geopolitical balance. They look at what hurts them. And to them, economy and jobs, safety and security, peace and prosperity become very important. All our economic prosperity today is designed to come from top down when we need bottom up approach. I was brought up in Gandhian environment, being born in 1942 in British Raj. After independence, there was a great deal of excitement in India because of Gandhian thought, which essentially focused on decentralization, human development. Small is beautiful. It also focused on non-violence. And I think our world has forgotten to focus on non-violence. Everywhere you look around, in every major urban areas, there is huge amount of violence. In US, we hear it every day. Shooting going on in shopping centers, schools, colleges, workplace. What is important is to really provide safety, security, jobs, employment, education, health to large number of people who are at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And that's where our focus ought to be. That's where our new technology has to be used, and not AI for defense, and not big data and analytics to control people. And I think we are going wrong in our approach to very fundamental values. And I worry about it. I worry about the fact that lies get propagated on social media, which affect common citizens, their pockets, global balance of power. And huge amount of money is wasted on unnecessary conflicts. Today we spend $2 trillion on defense every year. And now because of expansion of NATO, that number is going to go up. When we know that we can eliminate hunger for just about 200 billion a year. We have not been able to eliminate hunger, poverty, discrimination, inequality. I think those are the real challenges ahead of us. So the new economy is not about GDP, GNP, trade balance, per capita income. It's about fair distribution of wealth. Today, we tend to judge new economy based on how many billionaires we create, as opposed to how many people we lift out of poverty. Today, we judge economy based on stock markets and not employment. I am very worried about the global mindset. I think we need new conversation globally to take our democracy to inclusion, to take human rights to human needs, to take capitalism to new economy, where wealth doesn't get concentrated, where localization is given more importance, decentralization is at the core, and the focus is from bottom up development as opposed to top down. We want to begin to think of sustainability and conservation as opposed to consumption. We need to use technologies to really improve productivity, efficiency, reduce cost, but at the same time, make sure that we do not pollute our environment. Planet has to be at the core of our development. And finally, based on my own personal background, I believe the key is to focus on non-violent world. We cannot go on building military hardware the way we have in the future and expect violence in the world to go down. In America now there are conversations on gun laws. And recently I heard that some 18-year-old boy went to buy a cigarette, couldn't buy. Went to buy tobacco, could not buy. Went to buy some beer, could not buy because he was too young. But he went to buy a gun, and there was no problem. In that kind of a global system, how do we expect secure environment for our children? I think these are the problems. We know what the solutions are, but handful of people at the top have a different value system. They want to promote gun lobbies. They want to promote violence separately, maybe unknowingly. They want concentration of wealth. They want environment to be polluted. And that really bothers me because we are not listening. People at the top, people in power are not listening to the people at the bottom. They have lost sense of humanity. And they are really concerned about power equation. They are concerned about prosperity of the few. And that has to change. So I think the new economy has to really have very simple focus on lifting millions out of poverty, eliminating hunger, violence, providing enough food, nutrition, education, and health, and not really look at trade balance, GDP, GNP. Can be done. It's not a very complicated thing to do, but we need to think of redesigning. The present design doesn't work anymore. In a hyper-connected world, we need a new design which doesn't focus on profits and power, but focuses on planet and people. We know how to do it collectively, but we need to begin new conversation. And I'm here to really request all of us to think about how we are going to use new tools and new technology to really lift humanity to the next level, as opposed to go on fighting, go on killing, go on hoarding, and go on creating more billionaires. It is time to really get serious about redesigning the world. Answers are here if enough of us come together and create global conversation on this. I'm sure we can begin to change things. The way things are today, I worry about the world. I'm worried about my own grandchildren. The world I inherited from my grandparents was simple, poor, but secure, clean. In the world I'm delivering to my grandchildren is complex, polluted, full of conflicts, but rich. And I want all of us to come together to not just talk about what is happening in Ukraine. It is just a small little piece of the puzzle, but also talk about what is happening globally to humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And if you've just joined us, you are now participating in the International Schiller Institute online conference. There can be no peace without the bankruptcy reorganization of a dying transatlantic financial system. You just heard Mr. Sam Petrotta, who spoke to us in a sobering but at the same time forward-looking speech about the emerging New World architecture and the role of India, the United States, and other nations in building that New World architecture, with a specific emphasis on nonviolence, as you just heard. Our next speaker is Dr. Wolfgang Bittner. Wolfgang Bittner lives as a writer in Göttingen, Germany. He holds a doctorate in law. He's published some 80 books, including the political nonfiction books The Conquest of Europe by the USA, The New West-East Conflict, and Germany Betrayed and Sold. His topic today is the West-East conflict and orchestration.
Den West-Ost-Konflikt, den ich für eine Inszenierung halte. After the end of World War II, Germany was positioned as a European bridgehead of the United States against the Soviet Union and after its dissolution against Russia. In order to understand what is happening geopolitically today and why Germany is affected in a special way, one needs to know three things. First, that to this day, Germany has been denied a peace treaty by the allies of World War II, with the exception of Russia. Theoretically, therefore, Germany is still at war, since only an armistice was agreed in 1945. That is also clear from the so-called enemy state clause under Articles 53 and 107 of the United Nations Charter, according to which Germany is still an enemy state vis-a-vis the enemies of World War II. Supposedly, this no longer has any relevance, but if it did, this passage could have been deleted long ago. The enemy states clause states that coercive measures could be imposed without special authorization by the UN Security Council if Germany were to pursue aggressive policies again, including military intervention if necessary. Although Germany was granted full sovereignty by the Unification Treaty of 1990, the so-called 2+4 treaty, but this agreement has been relativized again by supplementary treaties, for example, on troop deployments and military cooperation. If one considers these facts with regard to the geopolitical situation in which we find ourselves, many things become clearer. Washington has considerable possibilities to exert pressure and influence decisions of the German government, which can be observed constantly. On the occasion of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's inaugural visit to Washington on February 8th, 2022, US President Joseph Biden simply stated that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would not be put into operation. Secondly, It is important to know that Germany is still an occupied country. It is hardly known that in addition to smaller military bases, the US has 11 large main bases on the territory of Germany. Military base of the US Air Force base outside the USA. The command center, I'm sorry, nuclear weapons are stationed in Büchel in Rhineland-Palatinate, and Ramstein Air Base is the largest military base of the US Air Force outside the USA. The command center of NATO's Air Force is located there. NATO monitors the alliance's missile defenses from Ramstein, and the US controls the worldwide deployment of combat drones from there. Germany is also a center of US espionage. In addition, since 1945, the US has covered Germany with more than 100 so-called think tanks, i.e. networks that represent US interests. Almost all of these leading politicians and journalists are members of these extraordinarily influential, well-funded organizations, of which the Atlantic Bridge is probably the best known. Moreover, many of these influencers have been trained in courses in the United States. Third, it is important to know that the US has systematically prevented cooperation between Germany and Russia for more than a century. This is also stated in a speech by US security expert George Friedman, and I quote, "The main interest of US foreign policy during the last century, during World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, was the relationship between Germany and Russia. When they are united, they are the only power that can threaten our supremacy. Our main goal was to make sure that this case does not happen." This policy has continued basically since the founding of the German Empire in 1871 to the present. Friedman reasons as follows. For the United States, the main concern is that German capital and technology combine with Russian raw material, resources, and Russian labor to form a unique combination. To prevent this, the United States has created a corridor full with weapons between Western Europe and Russia and has isolated Russia. In 2001, it was still possible for Russian President Vladimir Putin to address the German Bundestag. He advocated then and repeatedly thereafter a common economic and cultural zone from Vladivostok to Lisbon. He said, and this must also be quoted, "No one doubts the great value of Europe's relations with the United States, but I believe that in the long run, Europe will consolidate its reputation as a powerful and independent center of world politics only if it will unite its own capabilities with those of Russia. We have already taken the first steps in this direction together. Now it is time to think of what needs to be done so that the unified and secure Europe becomes the harbinger of a united and secure world." But further steps toward that goal have been stymied by the US strategists. The Russian president's offer of cooperation has been and continues to be opposed by US imperial pretensions. The aim is to eliminate Russia, and now China as well, as economic and military competitors and ultimately subject them to the unipolar claim. This hubris is determining the policy of the USA and has led to the fact that the whole world is disrupted. Chaos, conflicts, and wars wherever you look. Knowing all this, and all of this are facts, not conspiracy theories, much of what is happening today is self-explanatory. The US has long pursued a long-term strategy that serves its interests alone. In doing so, they go over dead bodies, and their vassals, including Germany, go along with every dirty trick. Now to long-term strategy and unipolar claim of the United States. In the view of its power elites, the United States of America is God's own country and called to rule the world. To enforce this claim, which is not justified by anything, they have developed a long-term strategy since the 19th century, including the maintenance of an overly highly armed army and the establishment of numerous military bases all over the world. At the same time, it cannot be overlooked that the US society, and right up to Congress, is religiously fundamentalist, fanatical in large parts. Right up to the present day, the elective affinity between Puritanism and capitalism and, quote, economic doctrine of predestination, quote end, whoever God loves, he will make rich, is deeply rooted here. Moreover, many of the hardliners apparently believe that anything that benefits the US ultimately benefits the whole world. This hubris was also followed by the policies of President Barack Obama, who comes across with a winning smile and who, in a speech to the military academy at West Point, called the US, quote, the only indispensable nation, quote end, the linchpin of all alliances from Europe to Asia, quote, unsurpassed in the history of nations, quote end. Obama thus professed what had long been the practiced policy of the United States. This power policy had its beginning at the latest in 1823, when President James Monroe, with a doctrine named after him, postulated a, quote, claim to protection and intervention, quote end, for Central and South America in the interests of the United States. Then in 1904, Theodore Roosevelt sweepingly authorized the US to exercise an, quote, international police power, quote, and to uncompromisingly assert economic and strategic interests. His motto was, quote, speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far, quote end. After all treaties with the Native Americans had previously been broken, and the last devastating battle had been fought at Wounded Knee in 1890, this applied primarily to the Latin American countries in the, quote, black backyard of the United States, quote end, but also to Morocco and Korea, and a little later worldwide. Quite in line with this was a statement by the subsequent President Woodrow Wilson. To ensure smooth US trade around the world, the US was justified, Wilson said, in blowing open closed doors, quote, even if it violates the sovereignty of recalcitrant nations, quote end. Barack Obama put it this way in a 2016 interview to US television station Vox, quote, we occasionally have to twist the arms of countries that don't do what we want to do them. We are the greatest, most powerful country on earth. We have no equal in the sense of countries that could attack or provoke the United States. The goal of being the world's #1 power was finally achieved by the United States after World War II, when President Harry S. Truman proclaimed in 1947 that US policy must be directed toward assisting free peoples, preserving their freedom for the preservation of peace in the world and for the benefit of the United States. how this leadership role then turned out in realpolitik to the advantage of the United States and mostly at the expense of the free peoples is shown by a look at history up to the immediate present. In October 2014, then US Vice President Joseph Biden boosted, quote, "We have Putin a simple choice. We gave Putin a simple choice. Respect Ukraine's sovereignty or face increasing consequences," quote end. By that time, the US prepared coup d'etat in Kiev in defiance of Ukraine's sovereignty had already taken place. Civil war had begun in eastern Ukraine, and US President Barack Obama was pressuring European leaders to impose tough sanctions on Russia. Now I come to Ukraine after the 2014 coup d'etat. On February 24th, 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine. Since then, Ukraine politicians have been romping about in the German media, making claims and insulting the German government for not adequately meeting the demands. Meanwhile, more than a few people are wondering why Germany should owe Ukraine anything at all. With what justification does the Ukrainian government demand money and weapons from Germany? And why is the Berlin government responding to it? If it is indeed following orders from Washington, it would be part of the problem instead of helping to solve it. Billions have been paid over the last few years, and Berlin politicians are paying more and more as if they could easily dispose of the money that is being taken away from their own people. In addition, several hundred thousand refugees have already been taken in. They have not been checked or registered, are being cared for, and can travel wherever they want within the European Union. For months now, after the corona pandemic, this constitutes a second state of emergency with serious repercussions. Recently, Federal Minister of Economics Robert Habeck even declared that Germany is a party of the war and must lead servantly. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said, repeating Joseph Biden's statement of 2014, Russia must be ruined with the sanctions. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, in his February 27th government statement, called Russian President Vladimir Putin a warmonger, and so on. Obviously, diplomatic customs and principles of international law no longer apply to Western politicians. How are Russian politicians supposed to be able to talk to them at all? It is claimed that Western values and democracy must be defended in Ukraine, and that this must be done with all available means, including not only billions of dollars in payments, but also arms deliveries and possibly, according to several politicians, NATO participation. But what has the situation in Ukraine actually been like since the regime change of 2014, which was prepared by the United States over a period of years? After the bloody coup, Crimea, which had been Russian for 171 years, had joined the Russian Federation following a referendum, and the Russian-speaking inhabitants of the Donbas, who had to fear reprisals, demanded more autonomy within Ukraine, which they were denied. As a result, they too broke away from Kiev, Ukraine, and proclaimed the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The result was a disaster that began with the civil war in eastern Ukraine. Then ruler Petro Poroshenko, an oligarch and US puppet, sent tanks and artillery into the Donbas to shoot at the population there. Some 14,000 people were killed, and towns and villages were destroyed. Involved were volunteer battalions, including the fascist Azov regiment, as well as American mercenaries, in addition to the Ukraine armed army advised by the US military. In order to resist, the Eastern Ukrainians enlisted support from Russia. A flashpoint was created on Russia's doorstep, and all attempts to extinguish it failed. Kiev, Ukraine, which fascists in its parliament and government, waged war against its own people, with the US behind it. The Minsk agreement to settle the conflict was ignored by Kiev, and the armies was rearmed. The fate of the country was in the hands of the US, which had taken over the country in a Cold War and positioned it against Russia. The further development up to the present moments is well known. A proxy war between the US and Russia, in which Ukraine is being pulverized. To justify this disastrous action with the defense of Europe corresponds to the systematic manipulation of opinion. Before the war, Ukraine was close to collapse and only hung on the drip of the IMF and the EU. Opposition members were persecuted and in some cases murdered. I named names in my book, The New West-East Conflict. The question is where we are and how to proceed. Hundreds of billions more for armaments. There will be an even greater inflation than before. Money for social welfare, education, science, and art will become even scarcer. The poor will become even poorer. Many companies will face ruin. In contrast, the army industry will profit immeasurably, and the US economy will jump into the gap and supply Germany with its expensive environmentally harmful fracking gas. The US and its vassals will continue to do everything possible to strangle Russia and bring about regime change in Moscow. Joseph Biden and his backers are almost there, with the help of the EU and the German government and its media. But Russia is a nuclear power, and US military bases in Germany are in the crosshairs of the Russian Air Force. The situation is dangerous as never before. Not only are we facing the collapse of the global financial system, we are also on the brink of a third world war that would make large parts of this world uninhabitable. Clarification of the true situation seems to me to be the only way at present to bring about the most urgent needed change in policy. One final remark. What I have been talking about is the public political situation in which we find ourselves. The worldwide disenfranchisement of the individual in favor of authoritarian institutions and systems of power is another issue. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bittner. And if you've just joined us, you are now participating in the International Schiller Institute online conference, There Can Be No Peace Without the Bankruptcy Reorganization of the Dying Transatlantic Financial System. You've just heard Dr. Wolfgang Bittner, whose topic was the East-West conflict and orchestration. Our final speaker for our morning panel is Dr. Clifford Kirikoff of the United States. He is a former senior staff member of the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and he is the president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development. His topic, diplomacy and cooperation in a time of crisis.
I would like to thank the Schiller Institute for inviting me to this much-needed conference series. My comment today will be brief, and my message is a simple one. To manage today's world crisis, we must encourage constructive diplomacy and international cooperation. Today's international situation is fraught with dangers, to include the risk of nuclear war and the risk of global economic crisis, chaos. The world today is moving forward toward multipolarity, what some observers call polycentrism, or others call pluralism. Despite this international trend, the United States and the West are in a misguided crusade to return to a Cold War bloc system and to Cold War zero-sum thinking. The bloc system, Washington and its European NATO vassals aim for, is one ranging so-called democracies on the one side versus so-called authoritarian states on the other side. This formulation of the Cold War bloc politics was the elite US foreign policy consensus agreed on in 2005. So it's nothing new. It's not new in Washington, D.C. We've seen it manifest itself in the Obama administration. We've seen it in the Trump administration, and we see it in the present Biden administration. This political bloc system has its economic counterpart that we see developing today in a bifurcated global economic situation. Some discuss the issue in terms of de-dollarization or a dollar zone versus a non-dollar zone or de-dollarized zone. The bifurcated economic situation is exacerbated by the global economic crisis caused by several factors. The process of formation of economic blocs is today accompanied by disintegrating economic conditions. So how did we get here, and what are the features? First, a weakening of the European economy began to be seen and noticeable in 2018, 2019. Then the Trump administration trade war and the Trump administration tech war, which is ongoing today under Biden, had severe negative effects. Then the COVID crisis struck, further weakening the global economy. Against this background, the absolute failure of European and US diplomacy to avoid war in the Ukraine resulted in the present situation there. The UN Security Council, in its resolution 2202 of 2015, endorsed the Minsk II process, but it never got off the ground, owing to Western neglect and the intransigence of the Kiev regime, which the West itself imposed on Ukraine via the Maidan coup in 2014. The Ukraine crisis further disrupts the global economy, and despite this, Western economic sanctions are piled up nonstop across the globe. Billions of dollars of US and European taxpayers' money are thrown down the Ukraine neo-Nazi sewer. The new round of Western sanctions, as all the other sanctions against Russia, not to mention against China, have a blowback effect on the Western economies and the global economy itself, and are thus counterproductive. That's self-evident. Just look at the numbers. These sanctions drag down and destabilize the world economy. Now we see rampant inflation, coupled with a global disruption of supply chains, energy, and food. Lurking around the corner is a collapse of financial markets when this modern South Sea bubble finally explodes. Far from sleepwalking into the abyss, we are marching straight into it in a mental state of denial, perhaps more appropriately deemed psychosis. Jamie Dimon just recently said of JP Morgan, the world is heading into a hurricane, the dimensions of which he could not predict. That's from a top international banker. So, what about the global financial aspects of this present crisis? Well, we all know that the central banks, particularly the US Fed and the European ECB, have been grossly irresponsible in monetary policy with endless printing of money and dysfunctional interest rates. This helicopter money, coupled with dysfunctional interest rates, bizarrely going negative, by the way, in many cases, causes unprecedented inflation as well as wild speculation in the financial markets. Some observers point to the bifurcation of the global monetary system. Presently, as is well known, international monetary system is based on the US dollar as the key reserve currency. We can look back to the origins of the present international financial system based on the US dollar, or some would say the US Treasury bill as the international standard, key reserve currency. And this situation has been in place since the Bretton Woods agreements in 1944. Now, 1944 is a long time ago, and the global financial architecture has become dangerously unstable today. Of course, financial stability is a key to properly functioning international economy. The alternative, of course, is instability, leading to chaos. Some experts believe we are today facing such a situation, as I just mentioned, Jamie Dimon himself, as a global financier. It is not unreasonable for states in this situation who are concerned by this reckless and dangerous international economic behavior of the West to consider protecting themselves. In recent years, the objective has been to taken the form of preparing what's called de-dollarization. That is to say, preparing for a time when the US dollar is not the single recognized reserve currency in what some call a US Treasury bill monetary standard, as I mentioned. So what's to be done? Well, a bifurcation of the international monetary system with two competing blocks butting heads is not an optimal long-term solution. No doubt, this process, which is occurring today, will continue for a time. We have to be realistic. But I think that's prudent, that we think creatively now about a way forward. Today, we are in a complex world crisis, but the phase of international life will pass. While in the dark days of this complex crisis, we must now think about the way forward and about creating a viable post-crisis situation. US President Franklin Roosevelt realized that the post-World War II era had to be shaped by pre-planning and action during the war itself, World War II. Thus, anticipating a dysfunctional global economic system in shambles as a result of the war, he moved to stave it off and to create conditions for post-war financial stability and for post-war cooperative diplomacy. Fortunately, the international community at that time was able to rally and to cooperate on the Bretton Woods arrangements and other aspects of the international financial architecture that were to come. Now, Roosevelt's vision for post-war diplomacy and international cooperation had two main features. First was the revival of a spirit of internationalism. The United Nations organization was created. Second, as a practical matter, Roosevelt hoped for post-war cooperation among the major powers, such as the United States, Russia, and China. Today, we need a new Bretton Woods, as well as constructive diplomacy among the major powers. That means inclusive diplomacy, it means constructive diplomacy, and of course, it's based on cooperation in a win-win formula or a non-zero sum formula, or we can say mutual advantage. The zero-sum Cold War bloc thinking must be rejected. There's only one world that we live in on this planet, Earth. So cooperative, comprehensive, and systematic thinking is necessary for us all in order to manage world affairs with good governance so as to promote international peace and development. In conclusion, I would just say that we must return to that spirit of internationalism that developed during the 19th century in the face of rising militarism. Internationalism fostered the cooperative projects of the League of Nations and the United Nations in the 20th century, after the ravages caused by ever-spreading militarism. So, in the face of today's unbridled militarism, let us resolve to a spirit of internationalism. Let's return to a spirit of internationalism, international cooperation, constructive diplomacy. And we should plan for a future, a shared future, that we can all look forward to. So that ends my comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Dr. Kirikov. And we are now have concluded hearing from our speakers. And if you've just joined us, this is the Schiller Institute International Online Conference. There can be no peace without the bankruptcy reorganization of the dying transatlantic system. You've just heard from Dr. Clifford Kirikov, former senior staff member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. And we're now going to bring our panel, those who are live with us, up on screen for discussion and comment. And so if we can begin to do that, and I'll see who we actually have. I see Helga is there. Hello, Helga. Sam Petroda is there. Hello. Dr. Bittner, I see you. And we should have Dr. Kortunov. Okay, there he is. And how about Cliff Kirikov? Is he with us? Well, all right, he will probably show up here on screen in a moment. What I'd like to do first, before going to any questions, we have a lot of questions that were coming in. We'll continue to scroll the way that people can give questions down on our bottom. But I'd like to first, Helga, ask you if you have any remarks, and then we'll ask and see if the panel has any reflections on what it's heard. So, Helga, if you could start us off.
Well, I think, first of all, I want to thank all speakers who all were incredibly powerful. And I mean, we will make sure that the speeches get out internationally as wide as possible. And I would actually ask the viewers and listeners to help us doing it, because I think the views represented here are an absolutely necessary counterpole to the synchronized media which we have in the United States and Europe otherwise, for the most part. And I think we have to, really arouse the population, because, there is such a discrepancy between what the official policies of the Western governments are doing and, the realities. And I want to thank Colonel Black, or Senator Black, for having us pointed us to the fact that, the evidence actually is that Ukraine has lost the war, which has been confirmed by several other Russian and other commentators. And I think that should really, redouble our efforts to press for a diplomatic solution. I also want to thank actually all speakers, and I don't want to comment now on every single speech. But if there is an agreement that the pending financial collapse and the hyperinflation going out of control is one of the main motors for the increase of aggressivity in the military field, I was thinking to maybe over today and tomorrow revive an initiative which we already had in the 2000s, calling for a new Bretton Woods committee. And we collected at that time literally thousands of signatures of parliamentarians and other people demanding a new world economic order. And maybe between the speakers of this panel and other panels, we could agree on a text, because I think the idea that we absolutely must move to a new paradigm before it's too late, because if you have an unprecedented collapse of the financial system, it can only end in a catastrophe. So I just wanted to throw that idea out, and we can discuss it more, and maybe by the end of the conference come up with such a proposal to go into an international mobilization for a new Bretton Woods system and a new paradigm in economics and international affairs.
Okay. Oh, I see you now there, Cliff. Very good. Welcome. I'm going to ask that other of the panelists who may have things to say would do that in the context of some of the questions. We've got a lot of them, and actually probably best to try to go to those questions because as you'll see, everybody has questions. It's present for everybody on the panel. So let me ask, the first question is directed to Dr. Kortunov and Helga, and this is from Kainan. His question is, the speech given by President Vladimir Putin at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum yesterday is very important to note within the context of this panel. And in that speech, Putin had declared that the unipolar world was dead, and that the majority of nations were moving away from the zero-sum game policies toward a new financial architecture. And he says, as Helga noted, the opportunity to cooperate with Russia in the development of the Eurasian continent was lost as a result of the short-sighted geopolitical policies of the transatlantic. And now the West is in the middle of a hyperinflationary blowout. How can this opportunity be presented to people in the West who have become so deluded that we have to now try to avoid a thermonuclear war? So I think I'm going to ask you first, Helga, and then go to Andrey, and then we can return to discussion among the panel.
Well, it really takes an extraordinary action, because as I think it was Foreign Minister Lavrov who stated that the relationship between Russia and the West, Russia and Germany, has been completely destroyed by the recent events. And, I feel, a terrible need to reconstruct that, because, we have a long history together. I only want to reference Napoleon, Hitler, the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, German unification, where Russia behaved incredibly generous. And I would really ask people to help to start a public debate that we do need to resume a dialogue with Russia, and this whole idea that the relation with Russia is out forever, as this unspeakable foreign minister of Germany is saying, cannot be tolerated. So I would suggest that we, really start to have a public debate and break through this uniform, synchronized, in German you would say Gleichhaltung, which we already had with the media with Goebbels. So we don't need to repeat that, but we need to have a dialogue where people can express their views, and that we really try to get a mass movement for a new paradigm. I really think that that is the only way how to go about it.
Okay, very good. Dr. Kortunov?
Well, thank you. Frankly, I'm a little bit more cautious in stating that the unipolar world is over. I think that in certain ways we still live in the unipolar world, especially if we are talking about the current financial system. Dollar still constitutes more than a half of international currency reserves, and dollar is still the major currency which all of us use. SWIFT remains the major international exchange system that exists in the world. I think that the current crisis will probably accelerate the move away from dollar. We see it in the recent decisions by the Chinese central bank, which is selling its dollar reserves. But I think it's a long process, and definitely we should do what we can to make it gradual, to make it incremental, to avoid major crises on the way to a more balanced system of a basket of currencies that might probably replace dollar as the main reserve currency in the world. Maybe today the time has come to think creatively about international financial institutions, including reforms within the international monetary fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, institutions like that, because if we do not reform them, then the odds are that parallel institutions will emerge and will compete with the old system. I think it's critically important to avoid a fragmentation of the global financial system, a fragmentation of the global economic system, because this is unfortunately the direction in which the global finance and the global trade is moving. I think that next 2 or 3 years will be critical in our ability or inability to reverse this movement. But I do hope that it is possible to maintain the global economic system and its integrity, and to make it more fair to everybody and more inclusive than it is right now. It will not be easy, but I think that with concerted efforts by major players, it is not impossible. Thank you.
Sure. So although we have questions for everybody, I don't want to stop any panelists from making any statement or reflection that they'd like to make now, either about what they've heard from others and otherwise. Yeah, Sam, I see you. Go right ahead. I think you're muted, Sam.
Somebody needs to unmute me, I guess. I'm okay.
Okay, we're good.
I'm okay from here. Okay. Now, my main concern is, who is listening to us? Are we talking to ourselves? Because I know there are hundreds of such organizations in the world who are having these kinds of conversations right now. I know many in US, India, Europe. The point is, are we getting any traction? I'm worried that irrespective of what we say, those in power are doing whatever they feel like doing anyway. I find that in India, the head of state decides to do whatever he or she wants to do, and they can get away with it. I think that's what is going on today in the world. Very few people are listening to a sane voice. Unless we bring all of these different organizations together, if not all, some of them, and really raise collective voice, it may have some impact, because we all agree with what the situation is. And I participate in many organizations like this, where people say, yes, this is the need of the hour, but then what? Nothing happens. And my concern is, how do we reach out to people who are in position of power, touch their heart, touch their mind, and say, hey, it's time to stop and move on with the new idea. And that's the challenge for all of us.
Would anybody like either to respond to him or anybody have anything otherwise that they'd like to say? Let me ask Cliff, if you have anything at this point that you'd like to take up. I think you're also muted, Cliff.
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, now you're good.
All right. So I would reemphasize my point that we need to pre-plan, or we need to be active now and get ideas out now prior to the hurricane that Jamie Dimon is talking about, or other financial experts are talking about. So I think conferences like this are very important, and they need to be inclusive, of course. But we need to, like Franklin Roosevelt, we need to be thinking about concepts and ideas now for when the storm really hits, and then for planning for after the storm. That would be, again, a new Bretton Woods kind of an idea, sort of an update or reform of present day international financial architecture, but much more inclusive, and of course taking into account ideas from Russia, from China, from India, et cetera, et cetera. So a more inclusive cooperation globally by major powers and others that have ideas to contribute.
Thanks. Dr. Bittner, I think you had your hand up before. Yes, please go ahead. Has he got the translation? I guess it's okay.
May I speak now?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. I want to speak German. Is that possible? Because I can't express me in English as different.
I'm pretty sure we have simultaneous translation possibilities. Yeah. So go ahead.
Okay. Helga
Zepp-LaRouche did talk about the German-Russian relations. There were the Napoleonic Wars, and there was the First and the Second World War. At other times, we had very good relations to Russia, culturally, scientific, and I want to address the cultural relations. The painting in Russian, I think about music, the Nutcracker suit of Tchaikovsky. I see many musicians, artists, painters whom we know, and the fact that we have cut off those relations because of this conflict, this is a tragedy of a century, and I fear that this will not be easily to repair. The view of Western Europe and Russia, especially after 1990, has been destroyed, and it will be very much work to pick that up again. And what happens at this moment is really a tragedy.
Okay. Now I'm going to return to questions, though a couple of the questions are general enough that there may be various people that want to answer. This one is directed at you, Helga, first. And again, I know that perhaps Andrey would like to say something about it as well. This is from Renata Sibra in Brazil. And she asks, I would like to know if there would be a role for the United Nations in this new security development and developing architecture, and why and what. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, how can the West manage its relations with China, considering the human rights positions, the lack of freedom of speech, so forth and so on? You get the idea there. So Helga, let me direct that at you first, and then we'll take it to a few other people if they have an answer.
Well, I think that the Schiller Institute could play a role as a rallying point for all individuals who would want to constructively work on the new paradigm. And at a previous conference, we already had an idea which unfortunately didn't get fully realized simply because events were, so much that we got distracted. But one idea would be that out of this circle and other participants in previous conferences, we have an enormous amount of experts on all fields: military, economics, science, diplomacy, culture, that we could work out a proposal for such a conference with joint efforts and then present it to the appropriate institution in the United Nations, because the United Nations is actually an institution which could launch such an initiative. And, that could go along with, what Cliff Kirakov also pointed to. I think the warnings that we are in front of a hurricane, we're sitting on a complete powder keg in terms of the potential explosion of the system. We are now between a rock and a hard place. If, no interest rate occur, you have galloping inflation. But if the central banks are increasing the interest rates, you are looking at a potential sudden collapse. And for that, we could also, move very quickly. I will make sure that we publish after this conference, or maybe even during the conference, the list of signatures which we had. I think we collected them in 2005, 2007, 97, even a new Bretton Woods committee, which was signed by thousands of important people around the world. And we could restart that, updated in light of what is going on. But the main response I want to say is I actually want to invite speakers, but also others listening and watching, to help to work out a platform for such an international security and development architecture. And, we had also many important diplomats in past conferences who could probably help us to find the appropriate place in the United Nations. Because, if these governments are not making what they should do, then we have to do it. And I think, it has reached the point where, that is absolutely doable.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Actually, there's a question that I will pose now, which is related to this, and it was to you, Cliff, and this was from Mir. It was is there a procedure to use internal institutions of nations so that they could punish political decisions being made against each country's interest? Like if you have a country that's imposing sanctions on another country, is there some way, they're asking, to use internal institutions from those nations to actually oppose those sanctions? That's kind of what the question is. And I think probably in the case of this UN issue, maybe this is one of these things you might want to take up. I think you're muted again for some reason.
Sorry about that.
Sure, go ahead.
So the United States has launched all these sanctions all over the planet. The internal institution in the United States, the United States Congress is fully supportive. So with respect to the United States, Congress is fully supportive of sanctions against China, Russia, and all of that. Sanctions being a form of economic warfare. So what we're really talking about is the Congress in full support, maybe a handful of members in either house opposed, but the US Congress as an internal institution is fully supportive of the US economic warfare strategy against Russia and China, figuring that Russia was going to be easier to break down, and then once Russia breaks down, China loses a friend, and then we can go after China. So that's the kind of the strategy of the Washington Beltway or swamp, or however you want to phrase the deep state crowd. In terms of the United Nations, of course, the United Nations has only imposed a few sanctions here and there. Unilateral sanctions by a country such as the United States without a UN sanction is actually not legal. It's not doesn't have standing in international law. It's a unilateral sanction. So the United States is most of the time here imposing unilateral sanctions. So which is a form of economic warfare. But the fact is, it completely sanctions as a tool, so-called, completely disrupt the functioning of the international economy, as we see, and as we will see when Jamie Dimon's hurricane hits. So sanctions are not, as a form of economic warfare, sanctions are certainly not a way to go. They're not really effective, and they blow back. They're counterproductive. So what we should try to be doing is, in the United States, stopping Congress from supporting all of these executive branch sanctions, which are, I mean, gasoline here for the car is well over $5 a gallon, and I don't know, 7, 8 out there in California. So there are hardships. This is just beginning. This is just the start of, and I think internally in the United States, as the public starts to realize it's not Putin, it's Biden. And it's the Congress that maybe the politics will change a bit between now and November.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions from anybody from the panel on this general line of questions? If not, I'll shift. There's a couple of others specifically. Okay, Sam, go ahead.
I think I'd like to follow up on the last conversation,
Sure.
And that is, how can we convince US senators to listen to this idea of redesigning the world, idea of restructuring, networking, getting off this command and control architecture to collaboration, cooperation, coordination, co-creation. Maybe that's a starting point, because if they listen, US will listen. If US listens, the world will listen.
Okay, sorry, I was just reading another question. Okay, so here's what it is. The question is from Boris Friedel, CCTV Berlin. He asked this question. This is directed, I think, Helga, to you and anyone else who wants to answer it. 2 of the 5 BRICS countries, South Africa and India, are attending the G7 meeting as guests. Is this a possible sign of a negotiating role for these 2 countries in order to keep communications going with Russia? That's the question that's asked.
It could be. I think the inclination of both President Ramaphosa and Prime Minister Modi to do that, I would think there is a very good likelihood, because India is a country of 1.4 billion people. The Indian Foreign Minister Jai Jankar recently at a conference I think it was in Bratislava, said that India is 1/5 of the world population and represents, I forgot now the exact amount of the GDP, and that they have the right to pursue their own interest. And, India has withstood, despite enormous efforts by Ursula von der Leyen and all kinds of other people, to put India into the camp of quote, democracies, India has maintained a neutral position, or better, non-aligned position. And I think the same is true for South Africa, where I think President Ramaphosa even, basically said that the West and NATO is responsible for the Ukraine crisis. So I think both of these countries, who are representative of the global South and the countries who suffer the most of these sanctions and the whole collapse of the economy, they have a right to speak out at this summit. And they are also part of what Duma President Volodin called the G8, which is emerging, which already altogether have a larger GDP than the G7. So, the miracle which we have to accomplish, mission impossible, is to get the G7 countries, or at least some of them, to basically stop the confrontation and say we need to address these issues together. And I think that is what this organization and all the other, and I agree with you, Sam, we should try to reach out to as many of these other organizations and try to really create a mass movement of people who demand that the world is not being blown up. And if there is enough mobilization around the world, it can happen, and they will have to listen. I'm a little bit more optimistic about the ability to have ideas impact politics. And that has a lot to do with the work of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and our movement for the last decades, because we have done that repeatedly. And I know that in a moment of crisis, it is not power, it is not money which counts, but it is the question, do you have an adequate idea which is needed at that moment? And then you can actually shape history. So I would say we should absolutely encourage India and South Africa in whatever way we can to play such a role, because I think that is what the G7 urgently needs.
Okay. I have various questions for various individuals, as I said, so let me just sort of take it this way. So there's a question which we have, which is directed I want to direct to Andrey, Dr. Kortunov, and to Helga. It's a question from Chengdu Economic Daily, and the question is, what is the expected impact of the Ukraine crisis on global food security and refugee health and energy issues related to food supply, both in Europe and the developing world, and how are countries, regions such as India and Africa, preparing themselves for it?
Well, yeah, if I
ahead.
might. First of all, I think we should keep in mind that the food crisis started to unravel long before the conflict in Ukraine. We saw food prices rising for at least 2 years, and definitely there were many reasons for that. We do need a new system of food security, including some reserves and better statistics and exchange of information on harvest expectations. If you take the Ukrainian crisis in particular, we're talking about the export of Ukraine proper. It is about 20 million metric tons of wheat, going primarily to Middle East and some African countries. It's also about the Russian wheat export, and also export of other food stock, like, for example, sunflower oil and other. And on top of that, we have the issue of Russian and Belarusian fertilizers. It's about 20% of the global output, and many countries in Africa, in the Middle East, and even Latin America depend on these fertilizers. So the prices are likely to remain high. I think that the issue of deliveries from Russia are not likely to be resolved, because it's not just about sanctions, it's about access to European ports. It's also about the payment systems, and it's about insurances. Of course, many companies are in the business of overcompliance. So I think that there'll be some not physical shortages of food, but definitely some negative impact on the structure of food consumption in many countries around the world. I think that this issue has to be addressed in a more systematic way, and definitely it would be great to have some sanctions waivers in order to allow the Russian wheat and fertilizers to go to international markets. But essentially what we need is more than that. We need something that I would call the Green Revolution 2.0, something similar to what the world was able to initiate back in 1960s, and something which made quite a dramatic change in the productivity of the agriculture in many developing countries like India and some African nations. Right now, we need a second revolution like that to make sure that the agricultural production is in plenty, and that we know how not only to harvest the food, but also how to preserve it and how to deliver it and how to process it. These are big issues. Finally, let me also say that, of course, many countries imposed restrictions on the food export, like India, for instance. But I think that it is understandable given the current situation in the world. I hope that already within the next couple of months, we will have some stabilization of prices on basic food exports. And the question is not to waste this crisis, but to think strategically about food security in years to come.
Okay. Helga, you want to add anything to that, or should we leave that?
Well, only one sentence, because this subject will be taken up in the second panel today. We have a whole group of farmers who are, absolutely motivated to double food production. And therefore, I would really suggest that we discuss this more in the second panel.
Okay, so here's a question that will probably cause a little discussion. Perhaps Cliff may get involved as well as Dr. Bittner. This is from Jerry Belsky, and he says this. He says, Dr. Bittner's characterization of post-World War II U.S. imperial policy of keeping Germany and Russia separated and in conflict as a continuation of American policy from the beginning of its history is more a characterization of British geopolitical imperial policy than the traditional American policy as understood by Lincoln and other followers of the American system. And so then he asks Helga if you would like to comment on the conflict between the American and British systems and the difference of them. And he suggests that the China Belt and Road, which and other things, he goes on like that, brought into Germany and Russia. I think that basically this is just a useful discussion anyway, and maybe several people, including Dr. Bittner, would like to talk about it. So we will start with you, Helga, then go to Dr. Bittner. Cliff's got his hand up already, so.
Well, I think if you look at the present Ukraine crisis, you can see again that it is always the British who egg on the Americans. If the US are not aggressive enough, then for sure you will have somebody from a think tank. I mentioned Rusi, but you could also take the various ministers. I mean, the role of the British it has been, and to basically perpetuate the British Empire. And just because it has taken a different shape, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Now, historically, for just very briefly, because this is a very long story, America made the revolution against the British Empire. The British Empire never forgave the American colony for that, and they tried to undo that. They did that with the War of 1812. They did it with the Civil War, in which the British Empire allied with the Confederacy against Lincoln. And when they realized that they could not win America militarily back, they started to say, let's manipulate the American establishment elite to adopt the British model of empire as the common platform. And that started after the assassination of President Kinley with Teddy Roosevelt. And it was throughout the 20th century with only few exceptions like FDR and John F. Kennedy. And especially in the last period, you had a complete a coincidence. Basically, after the Soviet Union disintegrated, where there would have been the chance for a totally new peace order in the world, the neocons, the Project for a New American Century, deliberately said, let's build an unipolar world based on the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. Economically, I can only advise our viewers and listeners to read, Alexander Hamilton, Friedrich List, Henry C. Carey, and you will see, and Wilhelm von Kardorff, very important. He wrote a beautiful little book, Gegen den Strom, against the stream, where he describes the difference between the British system and the American system. The American system basically being in the tradition of Leibniz, of the cameralists, of the idea that the only source of wealth is the creativity of the people, and that therefore it is the task of the state to to encourage the creative potential of all citizens, because that is what makes the wealth of the state, as compared to the British system, which is a system of controlling the trade, buy cheap, sell expensive, and manipulate and control everything in between. And that is the key conflict right now. And what people don't know is that the Chinese government, the Chinese model of economy, is much, much closer to the American system, to Hamiltonian banking. Friedrich List is the most famous foreign economist in China. Therefore, if the United States goes back to its own best tradition, which is the Hamiltonian economics, the idea of the American Revolution, of Lincoln, of Roosevelt, of Kennedy, then a cooperation with China would be very easy. It is the fact that the present politics in the United States has become British. And that is the key conflict. We have published an enormous amount about these things. And I think for people to understand that difference is an absolute precondition not to fall into the trap. Because if you just say, down with America, which a lot of people nowadays are saying because they're really completely fed up, that does not solve the problem. If it would be enough that all these other countries are building a new economic system, I think, that's wonderful, but it will not solve the problem, because I do not think that if the financial collapse escalates and we really reach a real crash, I don't think that the United States will dissolve as peacefully as the Soviet Union did in 1991, and therefore the danger of war coming out of this is what we should really be concerned with. But I think the difference between the British system and the American system, as it was conceived by the founding fathers, by Benjamin Franklin, by the first Washington administration, Alexander Hamilton, and as I said, Lincoln, I mean, that is the tradition we have to get the United States back to.
Okay, Dr. Bittner, if you want to say anything. He seems to be frozen. I'm not sure if he's heard me. Yes, Dr. Bittner, I asked if you had any response.
Dr. Bittner, I would like to say something
to the Britons, but first to Joe Biden. I think he is the worst of the current politicians. He is responsible of most of the of the current wars. He's he was foreign minister, he was vice president, and now he's president. He was active in Ukraine a lot. We know what was going on in terms of corruption there. In respect to this big big business with his son Hunter, and what happened in terms of the war entrance of Ukraine, that was he was responsible too. So the centrifugal forces in Western Europe increased in the last years, and that didn't change with the exit of with the Brexit. They became closer and closer to the United States, that is Britain. And what we overlook, they have also collaborators in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand. They have a big influence worldwide. And what Helga Zepp-LaRouche already said is that from their think tanks goes the war policy. I see that exactly as she. If we think about how World War I became possible, we actually stumbled into it. No. It was systematically prepared years before that, and the Weimar Republic was destabilized by Hitler, who already in the 20s was financed from foreign countries, which I actually wrote in my books. So there are indications of that. And World War II was basically in the pipeline already in 1919. It was in sight when the French Marshal said in 20 years we'll have a new world war. Also, this Second World War was prepared in advance. I don't want to get Germany off the hook. You know, there was a big part of that in Germany. I don't want to get missed on that, but because of the capitulation in 1945, the Allies could do it differently than after the First World War. So they actually went into Berlin. Oh, no, he is frozen. I hope he comes back soon.
Okay, we'll give it a few seconds.
Okay. Oh yeah, here he comes.
There he is.
Yes. If one looks at this geopolitical situation from a different viewpoint, as it is characterized in, for example, in German textbooks, there's another outcome, and we have to take care of that truth. The historical truth comes more and more to the surface, and we have to explain the world, the current situations. Otherwise, we will have a new and better world situation. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Cliff? Unmute. Oh, we got him. We got you. You're good.
Am I all right?
Yeah,
okay,
you're all right.
Cool, thanks, Dennis. I agree completely with what Helga was saying, and I commend the organization for delving into American history and finding truth about the American system as it contrasted and contrasts with the British imperial system. So I definitely would encourage people to follow Helga's advice and read some of the organization's literature and deep historical studies of that point. With respect to U.S.-German relations, well, you know, Friedrich List actually lived in the United States for a while. So List, as an economist, made observations in the United States that he could then apply to his own theoretical development and bring back to Europe with him when he returned. U.S.-German relations have always been good. with the exception of the last century. But Bismarck, for example, was a great friend of the United States, and he actually went to university at Göttingen with several American students. It should be recollected that back in that era of the 19th century, early 19th century, the German universities were really considered the top ones, and many young Americans, students went to German universities, particularly, for example, to Göttingen, and were influenced by particularly the historical school there at Göttingen, and which included some economics and anthropology, et cetera, et cetera. So U.S.-German cultural relations were very strong and very good through the 19th century. And unfortunately, with the rise of Nietzschean thought in Europe, particularly in Germany, but it's that Nietzschean trend, like the neocons today in the United States are essentially Nietzscheans. It's that Nietzschean trend in late 19th century Germany that caused, that amplified or helped bring that militarism upwards, sort of an increasing militarism that I mentioned in my own talk earlier, this sort of pervasive militarism all around the planet today, particularly in the NATO is what I meant. With respect to U.S.-Russia relations, they've always been excellent with some Cold War issues, of course. But from the very beginning, Catherine the Great, of course, helped us during our revolution with her armed neutrality strategy, et cetera, et cetera. So during our Civil War, Russia dispatched its fleet to New York and San Francisco to kind of deter or dissuade the British from getting too aggressive. So Lincoln was a close friend of the Tsars, et cetera. So U.S.-Russia relations throughout the 19th century were excellent. In the later part of the 19th century, the dean of the diplomatic corps in Washington, D.C., that is to say the most senior member of the diplomatic corps in Washington, was actually the ambassador from Russia, who was extremely popular back in that day. So we had excellent relations with Russia, of course, disrupted somewhat by the revolution, but nonetheless, when push came to shove, World War II, we worked closely with the Russian government and Stalin and all of that, Soviet government, if you want to use that phrase, and were able to achieve victory. Unfortunately, the Cold War poured cold water on the relationship. Nonetheless, President Eisenhower had great respect for Marshal Zhukov, for example, and there were back-channel communications through academic circles and diplomatic circles, et cetera. So the Cold War never really got out of hand. It was managed. So in today's very tense situation, naturally there's a cooling, frostiness in the relationship, but diplomacy goes on. Diplomacy will continue despite the Ukraine situation. And as things cool down over the next several years, I expect U.S.-Soviet relations to at least have some level of diplomatic contact. They're not going to be normal for a very long time in the future, a very, very long time. But I expect them to at least establish some good communications and hopefully not let things get out of hand. Although for the time being, we are in a nuclear danger, let's put it that way. It has been expressed by Colonel Black and others today. So I'm not pessimistic about U.S.-German relations. I'm not pessimistic about U.S.-Russia relations. I just think that we have to maintain diplomacy. You know, there's a long history to diplomacy. The earliest records of diplomacy that we have are between ancient Egypt and the Hittites, for example. That was a long time ago. So the role of diplomacy is very important and very ancient between states, between civilizations. The ancient Chinese had their forms of diplomacy. And then, of course, in the modern world, during the Renaissance era, we had a Renaissance diplomacy, as the historian Mattingly well described. So I'm always optimistic in terms of keeping the diplomatic lines open and going, even through third parties, even through indirectly through third parties. And I think ultimately, our relations will stabilize with Russia and hopefully get better. The problem we have right now is exactly what Helga said. There's a contradiction between our policy today and our traditional American policy. Why? Neoconism is one excuse, or one, but it's that penetration of the neocon thinking, which is Nietzschean, combined, let's say, with some of the British nostalgia for for what was it, the Great Game they used to call it, the British Empire competing with the Russians, and that those two streams of thought have infected the American elite in Washington, the swamp, we can say, or the deep state in Washington. So until we get back to an American way of thinking, as Helga precisely points out, until we get back to an American way of thinking, rather than thinking in terms of nostalgic British imperialism or neocon Nietzscheism or whatever the heck it is, it's going to take some work. But I'm optimistic that down the road, the U.S. and Russia will patch up their differences.
Okay, so I want to now just move to the conclusion. As we do that, just Diesel gives you the opportunity, if there's anything you haven't said, to say that. We are short on time, so I'm asking people to be brief, but I'm going to come, Sam, first to you, because you have at least two people who have asked you or directed questions in your direction. One of them is Jutta Perner from Germany, says, Sam speaks to my heart and my question goes in the same direction. How will this new architecture reach those people in responsible positions, and how do we get to the roots of this rotten system? And then there's a second, so that's the positive one. Then there's a second one, which says, to Sam, my response to your question, this is from Jose, as someone without authority, is that any action taken by any individual can cause an effect. I can't guarantee world leaders are listening, but everyday people are listening. And I would say there's more power in them now because they've listened to this panel than they had beforehand. Imagine the people who will watch this conference years from now. Will your words still be true then? If so, doesn't that give you real authority that supersedes those in power now because you use the truth when they do not? So those are the two things in your direction, Sam, and I just ask you to, in the course of your closing remarks, maybe respond to that.
No, thanks for both comments. They're very positive, very well articulated. I appreciate those comments. My main concern still remains the same. We know that world needs to be redesigned. We know that we need to focus on people and planet. We know that there are hungry, poor people all over the world who need education, health. We know how to do it. Why aren't we doing it? We also know that we don't need to build military machine to fight with each other. I hope in a hyper-connected world, we have evolved to a point we can settle our differences across the table. And we don't have to pick up gun, at least at the higher level. How do we get people to listen to this? That power and profit should not be the ultimate motive for everybody. We need to worry about our planet and our people. Again, we know how to do it. How do we change our existing structure? Whether it is UN, World Bank, IMF, NATO, WTO, WHO, or whatever. Can we build new institutions to respond to the new reality of the world? Can we dismantle existing institutions that don't work or modify? Can we really build networks of nations as opposed to borders to fight. We must celebrate humanity, irrespective of race, religion, caste, color. We have one life to live. Can we live with fulfillment, joy, concern for others? We can do it. I don't know why all of us don't come together and say, look, for the first time, we are all connected in the human history. All 8 billion people are connected. What does this connectivity mean to human civilization? Can we really redefine our priorities in a connected world? And I think that's the challenge in front of us. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Bittner, is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion? Dr. Bittner?
Ja,
Ja, ich möchte sagen, I want to say that the situation is out of control now. Nun, well, I think that the revolution is illusionary. It would be blocked. The states have now the governments of the West have now blocked this possibility because their control mechanisms are so strong. So the needed revolution will be very hard. So we know that internet forums are being forbidden and restricted, and that certain individuals get problems when they speak out, but we have to continue. I understand younger people, which I also have said in a presentation towards when young journalists ask me, and when they said that they have to to think of the family, that they have to go along, even though they don't want to. So we are independent. That means we have to lead the way, and we have to inform the people, which is, I think, the only way how we can make a change.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Cliff?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Helga, and thank you all to the panel and my colleagues for being great colleagues. I just would leave with a couple thoughts. Number one, diplomacy. Think diplomacy. Diplomacy, not war. Think internationalism, not militarism. Think international organizations that certainly can be reformed. We don't have to destroy the United Nations, but we can reform it, or other parts of the global economic architecture. So think positively and optimistically about that. Also, I would say to folks who have tuned in, there are English translations of the speeches of world leaders, such as President Putin and President Xi in English on the appropriate websites. So I would recommend checking out the speeches of President Putin on his website and also President Xi on his website. And I would recommend everyone to take a look at the English text of the February 4th Xi-Putin joint statement, which gives a vision of their vision of a future. And in final conclusion, I really like the work that's being done in China by academics on the theme of a community with a shared future. So thinking in terms of an international community with a shared future. So sort of a positive, cooperative, inclusive vision of the future and what we can be doing now to bring that about. So in conclusion, think positively, diplomacy, not war.
Okay. Helga?
Well, I think that people should prepare mentally that we are in all likelihood heading for the perfect storm, because as I said before, I think that the reason why the war danger is becoming so acute, it really only has to do marginally with Ukraine and things like that. It has to do with the fact that the Western neoliberal financial system is hopelessly bankrupt, and that the point which LaRouche made in 1971, that point has arrived, and there is absolutely no way how the system can be saved. And that means that unless we can mobilize internationally forces to go for a new Bretton Woods system with the 4 points I touched upon in my earlier presentation, I don't think that there is a way out. And that will become more clear to a lot of people. It's already clear to a lot of farmers around the world who are fighting for their survival in the middle of a world famine of biblical proportions, as David Beasley usually is saying. And it's also clear to a lot of people who are on the lower end of income. It's clear to owners and entrepreneurs of small and medium-sized firms. And I think that, if all the people who are participating in this conference would join, to help us to build this kind of network, link up with other organizations, get the study done of what are the right economic principles, look at the difference between the British and the American system, and study the physical theory or the theory of physical economy of LaRouche, the answers are all there. And, the need be that we are prepared, because the worst thing which could happen is that we have the perfect storm hitting, and, then you go into chaos, and chaos for sure will be another trigger of war danger. So I think we should really build this community of a shared future by preparing, to study the principles. How do we get the world in a better organizational form? And for that end, I want to invite you all to stay in touch with the Schiller Institute beyond this conference.
All right. Very good.
Thank you.
Dr. Wolfgang Bittner, Dr. Cliff Kirikov, Mr. Sam Petroda, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, want to thank you for being on this panel. And in addition, we want to thank Colonel Richard Black, Dr. Andrey Kortunov, and Professor Wang for participating as well. At 1 p.m., we will start panel 2 of this conference, which is entitled Runaway Inflation or Glass-Steagall. We'll join you back here in, just about an hour.